In October of 1975, on a stretch of white sand beach in Pattaya, Thailand, a fisherman walking along the shoreline in the early morning found a young woman lying face down at the water's edge. She was wearing a bikini, she was dead, and she had no identification on her. Over the next several weeks, more bodies turned up on beaches and in ditches along the tourist route between Bangkok and Kathmandu. Some had been strangled. Some had been burned. Some had been drugged and drowned. And all of them were young Western backpackers traveling alone in Asia, thousands of miles from home, in a decade when there was no internet, no cell phones, and no way for their families back in Europe and America to know that they were already dead. By the time the authorities figured out, the man responsible had murdered at least 20 people across 4 countries. And the worst part was, his victims had trusted him because he was charming, because he offered them food and drinks when they were tired and lost, and because every single one of them was dead before they realized what was in the drink. Into today's story. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here at Mr. B Paranormal, and we upload 2. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button offers you a very refreshing glass of water after a long day of travel, please just smile, say no thank you, and buy your own bottle from a sealed shop. Also, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. To understand how this story begins, you have to understand what the hippie trail was. In the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, there was this overland route that stretched from Western Europe all the way through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, and down into Thailand. And every year, tens of thousands of young Western backpackers, mostly in their 20s, mostly traveling alone or in pairs, would set out along this route looking for adventure, spiritual enlightenment, cheap living, and kind of the freedom that comes with being completely disconnected from the world you grew up in. You happened to be in, and it took 3 weeks to arrive, which meant that if something happened to you on the trail, it could be months before anyone back home even knew you were missing. And that is exactly the vulnerability that one man exploited. Charles Sobhraj was born on the 6th of 1944 in Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City, during the Japanese occupation of Vietnam in World War II. His mother was Vietnamese. His father was an Indian Sindhi businessman named Charles Sobhraj, who abandoned the family shortly after Charles was born. His mother eventually remarried a French military officer, and Charles was given French citizenship and raised, sort of, between Vietnam and France without ever really belonging to either place. He was kind of a kid who grew up between cultures, between languages, between identities, and the result was a young man who became extremely good at being whoever you needed him to be. By the time he was 19, Sobhraj was already in prison in Paris for burglary, and over the next decade and into his early 30s, he accumulated a criminal record that spanned at least half a dozen countries. Car theft, jewel fraud, passport forgery. Every time he got caught, he escaped. Every time he was imprisoned, he talked his way out, bribed his way out, or simply walked out. He was kind of supernaturally good at disappearing and reappearing as someone else. He carried multiple passports. He changed his name constantly. He spoke French, English, Hindi, and several other languages fluently. And he had, by every account, an almost hypnotic level of personal charisma. In 1975, Sobhraj arrived in Bangkok with a Canadian girlfriend named Marie-Andrée Leclerc, and an Indian associate named Ajay Chowdhury. He set himself up in an apartment block called Cannet House in a pleasant neighborhood in Bangkok, and he presented himself to the backpackers who passed through the area as a wealthy French gem dealer named Alain Gauthier. And this is where the murders began. Sobhraj's method was kind of devastatingly simple. He would befriend young travelers. He would invite them to dinner. He would offer them food and drinks laced with sedatives, usually a powerful tranquilizer. And once they were unconscious, he would rob them of their cash, their valuables, and most importantly, their passports. The passports were the real prize, because in the 1970s, a stolen Western passport on the Asian black market was worth a fortune. And Sobhraj used them to travel freely between countries under stolen identities, slipping through borders the way he slipped through everything else in his life. But some of his victims, the ones who saw too much, or the ones who woke up too early, or the ones who might have been able to identify him later, those ones didn't make it home. In mid-October of 1975, an American backpacker named Teresa Knowlton, who had been traveling alone through Thailand, was found dead on a beach in Pattaya. She was wearing a bikini. She had been drugged and drowned. That is where the nickname came from, the Bikini Killer, because several of Sobhraj's victims in Thailand were found on beaches, dressed in swimwear, as if they had simply gone for a swim and never come back. In December of 1975, the burned bodies of two Dutch backpackers, a young couple named Henricus Bintanja and Cornelia Hemker, were found on a road outside Bangkok. They had been strangled and then set on fire to make identification difficult. It almost worked, except that a Dutch diplomat in Bangkok named Herman Knippenberg started asking questions. Knippenberg had been contacted by the families of the Dutch couple, and when he started investigating, he discovered, through a contact at the Belgian embassy, that a French gem dealer named Alain Gauthier, living in an apartment in Cannet House in Bangkok, had an unusual number of foreign passports in his possession. Passports belonging to people who were either missing or dead. Knippenberg went to the Thai police. The Thai police were kind of overwhelmed and understaffed and not particularly inclined to investigate the deaths of foreign tourists when they had their own problems to deal with. So Knippenberg, basically on his own, started building a case. He gathered evidence, he interviewed witnesses, he connected disappearances across multiple countries, and eventually, slowly, the picture came together. The gem dealer was not a gem dealer, he was a serial killer. And his apartment was kind of a factory for processing stolen identities. But by the time the Thai police finally moved on Cannet House, Sobhraj was gone. He had slipped across the border into Nepal, then into India, then into somewhere else. Because that was what he did. He was the serpent, and the murders didn't stop. In Nepal in 1975, 2 more tourists were killed. An American woman named Connie Jo Bronzich, who was stabbed repeatedly and burned, and a Canadian man named Laurent Carrière, whose body was also burned almost beyond recognition. Both of these murders would eventually come back to haunt Sobhraj decades later. By 1976, Sobhraj had moved his operation to India, and this is where he finally made a mistake. In a hotel in New Delhi, Sobhraj attempted to drug a group of more than 20 French engineering students who were staying at the same hotel. He laced their food with sedatives, but he kind of got the dosage wrong. The students started collapsing in the hotel lobby, one after another, in full view of the hotel staff. It was too many victims at once, too many witnesses, too public. The police were called immediately. Sobhraj was arrested on the spot. He was charged with culpable homicide and poisoning. He was sentenced to 12 years in an Indian prison. And for a while, it seemed like the story was finally over. But then, in 1986, Sobhraj did something that no one expected. He escaped. He drugged the prison guards at Tihar Jail in Delhi, calmly walked out of the facility, and disappeared into the streets of Goa. He was recaptured 10 days later. And here is the part that kind of shows you just how calculating this man was. Because many people believe that Sobhraj escaped on purpose, specifically so that he would be recaptured and have extra time added to his sentence. Because the murders he was wanted for in Thailand carried the death penalty. And the statute of limitations on those Thai murder charges was 20 years. By getting caught escaping and having more time tacked onto his Indian sentence, Sobhraj ensured that by the time he was finally released from Indian prison, the Thai charges would have expired. And that is exactly what happened. Sobhraj was released from Indian prison in 1997. The Thai charges had expired, he flew to Paris, he was a free man, he gave interviews, He sold the rights to his story. He posed for magazine photographers in expensive restaurants. He lived openly in France for 6 years, and nobody could touch him. And then, in 2003, Charles Sobhraj did something that nobody in the world could explain. He flew to Nepal. Nepal, where Connie Jo Bronzich and Laurent Carrière had been murdered in 1975. Nepal, which unlike Thailand had no statute of limitations on murder charges. Nepal, where the police still had open warrants with his name on them. He walked into a casino in Kathmandu. He was recognized, and he was arrested. Nobody has ever been able to satisfactorily explain why he went back. Some people believe he thought he could talk his way out of it. Some people believe he went back to prove that he was untouchable. Some people believe he was simply so arrogant, after decades of escaping every trap that was ever set for him, that he genuinely did not believe that Nepal would dare to hold him. He later called the decision a fatal error. In 2004, he was convicted of the murder of Connie Jo Bronzich. In 2014, he was convicted of the murder of Laurent Carrière. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. And then, in December of 2022, on what his lawyers described as humanitarian grounds related to his age and health, Charles Sobhraj, the Serpent, the Bikini Killer, was released from Central Jail in Kathmandu. He was driven to the airport by a convoy of police vehicles. He flew to Paris. And as of today, Charles Sobhraj is a free man living somewhere in France at 82 years old. He is suspected of murdering at least 20 people. He was convicted of 2. And the families of the young backpackers who disappeared on the hippie trail in the 1970s, the ones whose bodies were found on beaches in Thailand and burned on roadsides in Nepal, those families have spent 50 years knowing that the man who killed their children offered them a cold drink on a hot day, watched them lose consciousness, and then took everything they had. Because in an apartment in Bangkok in 1975, a man in a silk shirt with a warm smile introduced himself to young travelers as a gem dealer, invited them to dinner, and made sure they never left. And the thing about Charles Sobhraj that has kept investigators and journalists and filmmakers coming back to his story for half a century is not how many people he killed. It is that he never once stopped smiling while he did it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime and paranormal episodes ready for you to binge right now. So, click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time. See you. On the morning of the 11th of November, 1988, 2 Sacramento police detectives and a federal probation officer knocked on the front door of a large, well-maintained Victorian boarding house at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, California. The door was opened by a small, white-haired, 59-year-old woman in a pink housecoat and reading glasses. She looked like somebody's grandmother. She smelled like lavender perfume. And when the detectives told her they were there because one of her tenants, a 51-year-old man named Bert Montoya, had not been seen in weeks, she smiled very warmly and said, "Oh, Bert. Yes, he left. He does that sometimes. He's a drinker, you know. He wanders off." She offered the detectives coffee. She told them not to worry. She said Bert would turn up eventually. And she was so calm, so pleasant, so completely at ease that the detectives almost left. They were kind of halfway to believing her. But then, as they were turning to go, one of the other tenants in the house, a man who had been standing in the hallway listening to the whole conversation, quietly passed one of the detectives a folded note. The detective opened it. The note said, "She's lying. Don't leave." But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here at Mr. B Paranormal, and we upload 2, 3, sometimes 4 times every single week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button invites you over for a home-cooked meal and tells you the previous dinner guests just sort of moved away suddenly, please eat before you go. Also, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. To understand how 7 bodies ended up buried in the front yard of a boarding house on a tree-lined street in downtown Sacramento, you have to understand who Dorothea Puente was. And that is kind of harder than it sounds, because Dorothea Puente was, by every external measure, a saint. She was a small woman, just over 5 feet tall. White hair, soft. She wore tailored clothes and costume jewelry and smelled like perfume. She went to church. She donated to charity. She attended political fundraisers. She handed out homemade tamales to people on the street. She was a fixture in the Midtown Sacramento community, the kind of person who knew everybody and who everybody liked. Local social workers referred their most vulnerable clients to her. Homeless men, elderly people on fixed incomes, people with mental illness and addiction problems, people who had kind of fallen through every other crack in the system. Because Dorothea's boarding house was clean, affordable, and run by a sweet older lady who seemed to genuinely care about the people who lived there. And the thing is, some of that was actually true. Former tenants who survived the boarding house would later say that Dorothea could be kind of genuinely kind. She cooked for them. She kept the house tidy. She bought them clothes when they needed them. She reminded them to take their medication. And if you had walked into 1426 F Street on any given afternoon in the mid-1980s, you would have seen a quiet, well-kept Victorian home with clean floors, potted plants in the windows, and a beautifully maintained front garden full of roses and tomatoes. But here is the thing about the garden. Because Dorothea Puente was not a saint. She was, in fact, a convicted forger, a convicted thief, and a convicted poisoner who had already served time in federal prison for drugging elderly people and stealing their Social Security checks. She had been convicted of those exact crimes in 1982, had been released early, and had been ordered by the court not to run a boarding house or handle anyone's finances ever again. She opened a boarding house and started handling people's finances almost immediately. Now, to understand how that happened, you have to go back further. Dorothea Helen Gray was born on the 9th of January 1929 in Redlands, California. Her childhood was kind of a disaster from the start. Her father was an alcoholic cotton picker. Her mother was an alcoholic who ran a brothel. Both of her parents were dead by the time she was 8 years old. She was sent to an orphanage. She ran away. She was married for the first time at the age of 16. That marriage fell apart quickly. She married again. That one fell apart too. She married a third time, and that one ended with her husband dying under sort of suspicious circumstances. She married a fourth time, and that one ended with her being convicted of drugging and robbing her fourth husband's elderly acquaintances. In between all of this, Dorothea developed two specific skills that she would use for the rest of her life. The first was her ability to present herself as a warm, caring, grandmotherly figure who would do anything to help people in need. And the second was her knowledge of how to administer sedatives to people without them knowing. By the early 1980s, Dorothea had established herself at 1426 F Street, and she was running a boarding house that catered specifically to people who were elderly, disabled, mentally ill, or struggling with addiction, people who received government benefits, people whose Social Security checks arrived every month like clockwork, people who, if they disappeared, would probably not be missed by anyone for a very long time. And that is exactly what started happening. The first death connected to Dorothea was in April of 1982, when her friend and business partner, a 61-year-old woman named Ruth Monroe, moved into one of Dorothea's apartments and died within weeks from an overdose of codeine and Tylenol. When police questioned Dorothea, she said Ruth had been depressed about her husband's illness. The death was ruled a suicide. Then, in 1985, a 77-year-old man from Oregon named Everson Gilmouth, who had been corresponding with Dorothea by letter while she was serving time in prison, came to Sacramento to be with her after her release. They moved in together. And within a few months, Everson Gilmouth disappeared. Dorothea told people he had gone back to Oregon. In fact, his body was found in January of 1986, sealed inside a homemade wooden coffin, floating in the Sacramento River near the town of Freeport. His cause of death could not be determined because of the advanced decomposition. Nobody connected the body to Dorothea. And then, the tenants at 1426 F Street started vanishing. One by one, over the course of several years, long-term residents of the boarding house stopped showing up to their usual routines. They stopped cashing their checks. They stopped visiting their caseworkers. They stopped calling their families, the ones who still had families. When anyone asked Dorothea where they had gone, she always had an answer. Oh, he moved up north. She went to stay with her sister. He checked into a hospital. She decided to travel for a while. The answers were always different. They were always delivered with a warm smile. And because the tenants were kind of people who existed at the very margins of society, people without advocates, people without anyone who was really keeping track of them, the explanations were accepted, and the checks kept coming. Because Dorothea had arranged things so that her tenants' Social Security and disability payments were deposited into accounts that she controlled. When a tenant disappeared, the checks didn't stop. They kept arriving, and Dorothea kept cashing them. Prosecutors would later allege that she collected more than $87,000 this way. She used the money to buy expensive clothes, to get a facelift, to take trips, to donate to political campaigns, to maintain the image of the sweet, charitable, well-dressed grandmother that the entire community believed she was, all while the bodies of the people whose checks she was cashing were buried in her front garden, under the roses, under the tomatoes, under the soil she so lovingly tended. And the only reason any of it came to light was a social worker named Judy Moyes. Because in the fall of 1988, Judy Moyes, who worked for a Sacramento organization called Volunteers of America, started looking for one of her clients. His name was Alvaro Bert Montoya. He was 51 years old. He was mentally disabled. He had been placed at Dorothea's boarding house by a referral program, and he had not been seen or heard from in weeks. Judy called Dorothea. Dorothea gave her the usual story. Bert had wandered off. Bert was a drinker. Bert did this sometimes. But Judy didn't buy it. She pushed. She called again. She called again. And eventually, she went to the police. Which brings us back to the morning of November 11th, 1988. When Detective John Cabrera read the folded note that the tenant had slipped him, the one that said, "She's lying. Don't leave," he didn't confront Dorothea directly. He just kind of asked very casually if she'd mind if they took a look around the property. Dorothea said, of course, she had nothing to hide. She offered them more coffee. The detectives stepped out into the garden. They looked at the soil, and they noticed something. In certain spots, the ground was softer than it should have been. In certain spots, the roses had been recently replanted. In certain spots, when they pushed a shovel into the dirt, the smell that came up out of the ground was unmistakable. They started digging. The first body was found that same morning. It was badly decomposed, it was wrapped in cloth, and it was buried about 3 feet down in the middle of the garden. They kept digging. A second body. A third. By the end of the day, the garden at 1426 F Street was kind of completely torn apart. Police were everywhere. News helicopters were circling overhead. The neighbors were standing on the sidewalk staring. And Dorothea Puente was still inside the house, watching through the window, still in her pink housecoat. Now, here's the part of the story that kind of still baffles investigators to this day. Because while the police were digging up bodies in her front yard, Dorothea asked Detective Cabrera if she could please leave the house for a few minutes to get a cup of coffee at a nearby hotel. And Cabrera, who at that point had not yet formally charged her with anything, and who was still kind of processing the shock of what they were finding in the garden, said yes. He let her go. Dorothea Puente walked out the front door, past the police cars, past the forensic team, past the cameras, past the bodies, and she disappeared. She was found 5 days later, on November 16th, 1988, in Los Angeles. She had taken a cab to a bar where she was recognized by another patron who had seen her face on the news. Police were called and she was arrested without incident. In total, 7 bodies were recovered from the garden at 1426 F Street. Dorothea was charged with 9 murders, including the deaths of tenants Benjamin Fink, Leona Carpenter, and Dorothy Miller. At her trial in 1993, she was convicted of 3 of the 9 counts. The jury deadlocked on the other 6. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dorothea Puente died in prison on the 27th of March, 2011, at the age of 82. She never confessed to a single murder. To the very end, she maintained that her tenants had died of natural causes and that she had merely buried them in the garden because she didn't want to lose their Social Security checks, which is kind of an extraordinary thing to say out loud and expect anyone to believe. The house at 1426 F Street still stands today. It is a private residence. The garden has been replanted. And if you were to walk past it on a warm afternoon, you would see a nice Victorian house on a tree-lined street with flowers in the window boxes and a tidy yard. You would have no idea what was underneath. Because in a quiet boarding house in downtown Sacramento, for most of a decade, a small white-haired woman in a pink housecoat opened her door to the people that the rest of the world had forgotten. The homeless, the elderly, the disabled, the addicted, the ones nobody was looking for. She gave them a bed. She cooked them dinner. She smiled at them across the table. And then she buried them in the garden and kept cashing their checks. And the most disturbing thing about Dorothea Puente is not the bodies. It is the fact that the community loved her, that social workers sent vulnerable people to her door, that politicians shook her hand at fundraisers, that she was, for years, one of the most respected women in her neighborhood. Because the monster was not hiding. She was standing right there, in a pink housecoat, offering coffee. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime and paranormal episodes ready for you to binge right now. So, click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In the spring of 1971, a 23-year-old man who had just been released from a maximum security psychiatric hospital after 9 years walked into a new job at a photographic supply company in a small English village called Bovingdon. He was quiet, he was polite, and on his very first day, he did something that his new coworkers thought was kind of sweet. He volunteered to make the tea. He said he didn't mind. He said he actually enjoyed it. And for the next several months, every single morning, this young man would carefully prepare cups of tea and coffee for the people around him, delivering them with a small smile and sometimes a biscuit on the side. His colleagues liked him. They thought he was thoughtful. And when, one by one, they started getting violently ill, losing feeling in their legs, losing their hair, and eventually dying, nobody suspected the tea. Because nobody knew that the quiet young man making it had already killed his own stepmother with poison when he was 14 years old. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here at Mr. B Paranormal. And we upload 2, 3, sometimes 4 times every single week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button offers to make you a cup of tea, please. And I cannot stress this enough, make your own. Also, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Graham Frederick Young was born on the 7th of September 1947 in Neasden in northwest London. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was 3 months old. His father, Fred, couldn't manage a newborn on his own, so Graham was sent to live with an uncle and aunt, while his older sister, Winifred, went to live with the grandparents. By all accounts, Graham's childhood was kind of unremarkable. His aunt and uncle were decent people. They gave him a stable home, he went to school, he was quiet. He didn't really have friends, but he wasn't bullied either. He was just sort of a background kid. Except for one thing. By the age of 11, Graham Young had developed a fascination with chemistry. Not the fun kind, where you mix baking soda and vinegar and make a volcano. The other kind. The kind where you sit in the public library for hours reading textbooks on pharmacology and toxicology, and memorizing the lethal dosage thresholds of substances that most adults have never even heard of. Graham's favorite subject, from the age of roughly 12, was poison. Specifically, he was interested in antimony, arsenic, digitalis, and thallium. He knew how each one worked. He knew what symptoms each one produced. He knew which ones were tasteless. He knew which ones were slow. And he knew which ones you could buy in 1960s London without anyone asking too many questions. Because the thing about Graham Young that kind of separates him from almost every serial killer in history is that he didn't wait until he was an adult to start. He started poisoning his own family when he was 14 years old. In the early months of 1961, Graham's stepmother, Molly, his father, Fred, and his sister, Winifred, all started getting sick. It was sort of the same symptoms in all of them. Stomach cramps, nausea, vomiting, fatigue. They assumed they were all coming down with the same bug. Fred actually wondered at one point whether it might be the chemistry set he had bought Graham for Christmas, that maybe Graham was kind of accidentally contaminating the kitchen. He asked Graham about it. Graham denied it, and nobody thought to check further. What Graham was actually doing was adding small doses of antimony potassium tartrate to the family's food. He was buying it from a London pharmacy. He told the pharmacist he needed it for school experiments. The pharmacist sold it to him, and Graham, who was keeping a detailed diary of doses and reactions at home, was systematically increasing the amounts to see what would happen. What happened was that his stepmother, Molly Young, died on the 21st of April, 1962. Her cause of death was officially recorded as complications from a bone marrow issue. Nobody suspected poison. Nobody tested for it. Nobody had any reason to. She was cremated. Now here is where it gets kind of unbelievable, because Graham did not stop after his stepmother died. He kept poisoning his father. He kept poisoning his sister. And he started poisoning a school friend named Christopher Williams, just apparently to see what would happen. The only reason he got caught was that his chemistry teacher noticed something strange. Graham's schoolwork was kind of unusually advanced. The essays he was turning in were not about hydrogen and oxygen and the periodic table. They were about the specific toxic properties of obscure chemical compounds. The teacher flagged it. The school contacted a doctor. The doctor contacted the police. And the police sent Graham to a psychiatrist, where during the interview, Graham's detailed knowledge of poisons became so obvious that the psychiatrist actually became alarmed during the session. On the 23rd of May, 1962, Graham Young was arrested. He was 14 years old. He admitted to poisoning his father, his sister, and his school friend. He was not charged with the murder of his stepmother because there was no body to test. She had been cremated. But privately, Graham admitted to his aunt that he had killed her. And when he was committed to Broadmoor, the maximum security psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane, he became the youngest inmate the institution had admitted since the 1880s. And here is where kind of every institution that was supposed to keep people safe failed completely, because Graham spent 9 years at Broadmoor. During those 9 years, he allegedly poisoned at least one fellow patient and possibly members of staff. The patient he poisoned died. The death was ruled a suicide. Nobody connected it to Graham. And in 1970, the prison psychiatrist, a man named Edgar Udwin, wrote a recommendation to the Home Secretary stating that Graham was, and I'm quoting here, no longer obsessed with poisons, violence and mischief, and recommending his release. Graham Young walked out of Broadmoor on the 4th of February 1971. He was 23 years old. And according to one account, on his way out the door, he told a nurse that he intended to kill one person for every year he had been detained. He was placed in a government rehabilitation program. He was given a bed at a hostel, and he got a job. The job was at John Hadland Laboratories, a photographic supply company in the village of Bovingdon, in Hertfordshire. The company had been told by the placement program that Graham had suffered a breakdown following a bereavement. They were not told he had been in Broadmoor. They were not told he was a convicted poisoner. They were not told any of it. Graham started in the spring of 1971. He was assigned to the stockroom, and right away, he volunteered to be the one who made the tea and coffee for the office. Nobody thought twice about it. The first to get sick was his boss, a 59-year-old man named Bob Eagle. Eagle was a well-liked, healthy guy who had been at the company for years. But within weeks of Graham's arrival, Eagle started experiencing terrible stomach cramps, then numbness in his legs. Then the most alarming symptom of all, his hair started falling out in clumps. Bob Eagle died on the 7th of July, 1971. His cause of death was recorded as bronchopneumonia and polyneuritis. Nobody suspected poison. A few weeks later, another employee, a man named Fred Biggs, started getting sick. Same symptoms: cramps, numbness, hair loss, progressive weakness. Biggs deteriorated slowly over the course of several months and eventually died on the 19th of November, 1971. His death was also attributed to natural causes. Meanwhile, other people in the office were getting ill, not dying, but getting very, very sick. Stomach pain, vomiting, tingling in the extremities. The employees started calling it the Bovingdon bug because they assumed it was some kind of virus going around the office. The company brought in a medical officer. They called the local health authority. Someone suggested it might be caused by contamination from a disused wartime airfield near the factory. Tests were run on the water supply. Nothing came back. And Graham, who was still making the tea, was never questioned. In fact, Graham was the opposite of suspected. He was actually one of the most vocal and concerned employees when it came to discussing the Bovingdon bug. He asked detailed medical questions. He speculated about causes. He suggested theories. And in one meeting, when the company's doctor was briefing staff on the mystery illness, Graham raised his hand and asked whether the symptoms might be consistent with thallium poisoning. The room went quiet for a second. The doctor looked at Graham and said, "Well, that's an oddly specific suggestion." But then the conversation moved on, except that somebody in that meeting remembered what Graham had said. and that somebody mentioned it to a supervisor who kind of started asking around about the new guy in the stockroom. And when they found out that Graham had spent time at Broadmoor, the police were finally called. On the 21st of November, 1971, police arrived at Graham's home. When they searched his room, they found a detailed diary. In the diary, Graham had recorded the exact dosages of thallium and antimony he had administered to each of his coworkers, along with their symptoms and his clinical observations. He had also written a list. The list contained the names of colleagues he intended to poison next. And when the police arrested him, they found a lethal dose of thallium in his pocket. At his trial in June of 1972, at St. Albans Crown Court, Graham Young pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of administering poison. He was convicted on all charges, and when the judge asked if he had anything to say, Graham's only response was, "What I feel is the emptiness of my soul." He was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. Graham Young died in his cell at Parkhurst on the 1st of August, 1990. He was 42 years old. His cause of death was recorded as a heart attack. There were rumors, which have never been confirmed, that he had poisoned himself. Other rumors suggested that fellow inmates, who were well aware of his history, had done it for him. The truth is that nobody really knows how Graham Young died, which is kind of fitting. Because in a quiet office, in a quiet village in the English countryside, a polite young man made cups of tea for his colleagues every single morning. He carried the cups to their desks on a tray. He sometimes brought biscuits. He asked how their weekends were. He smiled. And when they started dying, one by one, nobody looked at the man with the teacup. Because he was so pleasant. Because he was so helpful. Because who on earth would suspect the man who makes the tea? And the answer, which Graham Young proved twice in his life, once as a child and once as an adult, is that nobody does. That is the whole point. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime and paranormal episodes ready for you to binge right now. So, click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the morning of the 2nd of July, 1931, inside a prison in the city of Cologne, Germany, a 48-year-old man sat down for his last meal before his scheduled execution by guillotine. He had been convicted of 9 murders and 7 attempted murders, and over the course of the last year, he had calmly and methodically described every single one of them to a psychiatrist in extraordinary detail, including the fact that on several occasions, he had drunk his victims' blood directly from their wounds. Now, sitting across from the prison chaplain with his final plate of food in front of him, the man who the German press had nicknamed the Vampire of Dusseldorf looked up and asked very politely if he could please have a second helping. And when the chaplain said yes and the plate was brought, the condemned man smiled and said, "Thank you. This will be my pleasure." But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here at Mr. B Paranormal, and we upload 2, 3, sometimes 4 times every single week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button asks you very cheerfully whether you'd like a nice cup of tea, just politely decline and make your own. Also, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 10:00 p.m. on the 14th of May, 1930, a 21-year-old woman named Maria Budlick stepped off a train at the central station in Dusseldorf, Germany. She was alone. She didn't know the city. She had come from Cologne looking for work as a domestic servant, and she had nowhere to sleep that night. So when a friendly-looking man in a clean suit and hat approached her on the platform and asked if she needed help finding her way, Maria kind of hesitated for a second, but said yes. The man walked her through the station and into the streets. He was polite. He was calm. He was roughly 46 years old, well-dressed, and by every appearance, just a nice gentleman helping a young woman find her way in a new city. He told her his name was Fritz. He told her he knew a place she could stay. And as they walked together through the quiet streets, the man led Maria away from the city center and into a large public park at the edge of town called the Grafenberger Wald. Now, by this point in 1930, the entire city of Dusseldorf was kind of in a state of collective panic. Because for the last 14 months, someone had been killing people in this city, stabbing them, strangling them, beating them with a hammer. The victims ranged from young children to middle-aged adults. Some had been attacked at random on the street. Some had been lured into quiet areas. Some of the bodies had bite marks. At least one victim had been partially drained of blood. The newspapers had given the killer a name. They were calling him the Vampire of Dusseldorf, and nobody in the city knew who he was. Maria Budlik did not know any of this. She was from Cologne. So when the man calling himself Fritz led her deeper and deeper into the trees, away from the streetlights, away from the roads, away from anyone who could hear her if she screamed, she just kind of followed, because he seemed so pleasant. And it was only when they reached a clearing in the woods, in the dark, with nobody around, and the man suddenly grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her against a tree, that Maria Budlik realized what was happening. The man assaulted her. Maria fought back, and at some point during the struggle, almost impossibly, the man stopped. Maria would later tell police that something shifted in him, like he kind of flipped a switch. He released her. He asked her if she remembered where he lived. She said no, because he had never told her. And at that, the man straightened his clothes, tipped his hat, and walked away into the dark. Maria stumbled out of the park. She found a stranger on the street who helped her get to the police station. And because she couldn't remember the man's name or his address or anything specific about him except the route they had walked, the police more or less filed the report and moved on. But Maria did something else. She sat down the next day and wrote a letter to a friend describing what had happened. She addressed the letter carefully, sealed it, and posted it. But she got the address slightly wrong. And the letter was opened by a stranger who lived in the building. A woman who had no idea who Maria was, but who read the letter, went pale, and took it directly to the police. Because the route Maria described in the letter, the walk through the Grafenberger Wald, the clearing, the assault, matched the exact pattern the police had been tracking for over a year. The police went back to Maria and asked her to try harder. Walk us through it again. Show us the route. And this time, Maria remembered one detail she hadn't mentioned before. She remembered a street. She remembered a building. And she remembered, once she was standing in front of it again, the exact apartment the man had briefly taken her to before leading her into the woods. When the police traced the apartment, they found that it was rented by a man who had been living in Dusseldorf for about 5 years. He worked in a factory. He was married. His wife was a former prostitute who had served time for killing her previous fiancé. The neighbors described them as a quiet couple who kept to themselves. The man's name was Peter Curtin. To understand how a factory worker in a clean suit with a soft voice and a polite handshake became the most feared serial killer in German history, you have to go back a long way. Peter Curtin was born on the 26th of May, 1883, in Koln-Mühlheim, a suburb of Cologne. He was the eldest of 13 children. The family lived in a single room. His father was an alcoholic with kind of violently sadistic tendencies, who beat and assaulted his wife and children regularly, and who was eventually imprisoned for assaulting his own 13-year-old daughter. As a small boy, Curtin was, by his own later account, taught by a local dog catcher how to torture animals, specifically by stabbing dogs and watching them bleed. By the age of 9, according to his later confessions, Curtin had already attempted to drown 2 schoolmates by pushing them off a raft into the Rhine. Both boys disappeared. The deaths were ruled accidental. Curtin drifted through petty crime for the next 2 decades: theft, arson, assault. He was in and out of prison more than 20 times. He spent a total of roughly 20 years behind bars before 1925, which meant that for the majority of his adult life, he was locked up. And every time he got out, he would kind of escalate. His first documented murder was in 1913. He broke into a pub in Cologne that was closed for the night, went upstairs to the apartment above it, and found a 10-year-old girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. He cut her throat with a pocket knife. He later told the psychiatrist who studied his case that during the act, he had been overwhelmed by, and I'm quoting his own words here, a sense of tremendous elation. He was never identified as the killer. An uncle of the child was actually arrested and tried for the crime. The uncle was acquitted due to lack of evidence, but the suspicion ruined his life. Curtin wasn't caught. He went back to prison for unrelated crimes. And when he was finally released in 1925, he moved to Dusseldorf. He got a job. He joined a trade union. And for about 4 years, he sort of functioned. He was, by every external measure, a normal member of society. His neighbors liked him. His co-workers thought he was pleasant. His wife didn't know. And then, in February of 1929, the switch flipped again. Over the next 9 months, from February to November of 1929, Peter Curtin murdered at least 9 people and attempted to murder many more. He used scissors, he used knives, he used a hammer, he attacked men, women, and children, he attacked on the street, he attacked in parks, he attacked on the banks of the Rhine. He burned one victim's body after the killing. He mailed taunting letters to the newspapers, including one with a map showing the police exactly where to find a body they had not yet discovered. An 8-year-old girl named Rosa Oliger, a 45-year-old mechanic named Rudolf Scheer, 2 foster sisters, aged 5 and 14, at a fairground in Flehe, a servant girl named Ida Reuter, a young woman named Elizabeth Dorier, and the last, a 5-year-old girl named Gertrude Alberman, whom he stabbed over 30 times and buried under builders' rubble. The city of Dusseldorf was in absolute chaos. Thousands of tips came in. Vigilante patrols walked the streets. An innocent man with a learning disability was actually convicted of one of the crimes and spent time in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And through all of it, Peter Curtin kept showing up to work, kept eating dinner with his wife, and kept reading the newspaper articles about his own crimes with a kind of quiet satisfaction that he would later describe as a feeling of warmth. And then Maria Budlick survived. And when the police identified Curtin from her letter, they didn't go to his apartment immediately. They went to Maria first. They showed her photographs. She identified him. And then, before the police could make their move, something very unusual happened. Curtin's wife came in because Curtin, on the morning of the 24th of May, 1930, sat down with his wife over breakfast and told her everything, all of it. Every murder, every attack, every detail. And then he told her that there was a substantial reward being offered for information leading to the arrest of the vampire of Dusseldorf, and that she should turn him in, collect the money, and use it to start a new life. She did. Curtin was arrested that same day. He confessed immediately, and over the following months, he was examined by a psychiatrist named Carl Berg, to whom he gave an extremely detailed accounting of every crime he had committed, including ones the police had not even linked to him yet. He was calm throughout. He was articulate. He was polite. And the thing that kind of disturbed Berg the most was not anything Curtin said about the violence itself. It was the fact that Curtin clearly enjoyed the interview more than anything else in his life. He was, for the first time, being taken seriously, and he was being listened to. And that, to Curtin, was its own kind of pleasure. He was tried in April 1931. He was found guilty of 9 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death. And on the 2nd of July, 1931, at Klingelputz prison in Cologne, Peter Curtin walked to the guillotine. His final words, spoken to the chaplain who was walking beside him, were a question. He asked, "Tell me, after my head is cut off," at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck. He paused, and then he said, "That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." The blade came down at 6:00 a.m., and the thing that has stayed with investigators and psychiatrists for nearly 100 years since is not the crimes themselves, as horrific as they were. It is that Peter Curtin passed every single psychiatric evaluation he was ever given. He was not legally insane. He was not delusional. He understood exactly what he was doing every single time he did it. He understood right from wrong. He simply did not care. His brain, when examined after his death, showed no structural abnormalities. There was nothing wrong with him in the medical sense. He was, by every clinical measure, a perfectly normal human being who chose deliberately to do monstrous things. And the psychiatrist who spent months interviewing him wrote in his final report that of all the criminals he had studied in his career, Peter Curtin was the only one who genuinely frightened him. Because in a quiet apartment in Dusseldorf, for 4 years, a factory worker with a soft voice and a clean suit sat across the dinner table from his wife every single evening and smiled at her. And she smiled back. And neither of them said a word about what he had been doing that afternoon. And the most unsettling thing about Peter Curtin is not what he did. It is that nobody saw it coming, and he looked exactly like everyone else. The man who fell into the storm today's story is about a man who, on the day before Thanksgiving in 1971, walked onto a commercial airplane in Oregon, hijacked it with a bomb, demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes, and then, before the plane could land, opened the back door in midair and jumped out into a thunderstorm. He was never found. And to this day, over 50 years later, his real identity is still one of the most obsessed over mysteries in the history of the FBI. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. At around 2:50 in the afternoon on Wednesday, November 24th, 1971, at Portland International Airport in Oregon, a man in his mid-40s walked up to the ticket counter of an airline called Northwest Orient. He was wearing a dark suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and shiny black leather shoes. He was carrying a briefcase. He looked like basically every other businessman in the terminal that day. The man handed the ticket agent a $20 bill and asked for a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington. When the ticket agent asked him his name, the man said, quote, Dan Cooper. And the ticket agent typed the name Dan Cooper into her system, printed him a boarding pass for a flight called Northwest Orient Flight 305, and handed it to him. And Dan Cooper walked away. An hour later, Dan Cooper boarded that flight. He was assigned to seat 18C at the back of the plane on the aisle. The plane was a Boeing 727-100, and it had 36 other passengers on board that afternoon. Cooper sat down in his seat, put his briefcase on his lap, and lit a cigarette. When the flight attendant, a young woman named Florence Schaffner, walked past him, Cooper ordered a bourbon and 7-Up. Florence brought him the drink. Cooper paid her with cash. And then, once the plane had taken off and was in the air, Cooper called Florence back to his row, and he handed her a folded piece of paper. Florence looked at the paper, and she assumed it was a phone number, because a lot of male passengers on that route used to try to slip her their phone numbers. So she basically just kind of thanked him, and she went to put the paper in her pocket without reading it. But Cooper leaned toward her, and he said, quote, Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb. Florence very quietly opened up the piece of paper. And what she read on that paper was neat capital letter handwriting that said, quote, I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit next to me. Florence sat down next to Cooper, who then opened up his briefcase, just enough for her to see inside of it. And Florence would later describe what she saw as being what appeared to be several red cylinders wired together, connected to a battery. It looked, at least to her eyes, like a real bomb. Cooper closed the briefcase, and then very calmly, he gave Florence his list of demands. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills, delivered to him in a knapsack. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 front and 2 back. And he wanted a fuel truck standing by at the Seattle airport to refuel the plane the moment they landed. If any of his demands were not met, he told her, he was going to blow up the entire plane. Florence walked, as calmly as she could, up to the front of the aircraft, and she gave the note to the pilot, a captain named William Scott. Captain Scott immediately radioed Seattle Air Traffic Control, and Seattle Air Traffic Control immediately relayed the message to the FBI. And for the next 2 hours, as the plane circled over Seattle waiting to land, Northwest Orient and the FBI and the president of the airline, whose name was Donald Nyrop, worked to get Cooper what he was asking for. The plane finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at around 5:39 p.m. Cooper's demands were met in full. The $200,000 in $20 bills, which is the equivalent of about $1.5 million today, was loaded onto the plane inside a canvas knapsack. 4 parachutes were delivered, and a fuel truck rolled up to refuel the plane. In exchange, Cooper released all 36 of the other passengers, along with Florence Schaffner and the other main flight attendant. He kept the pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and one flight attendant named Tina Mucklow on board with him. Then Cooper gave the pilots a new set of instructions. He told them to fly the plane to Mexico City, but he wanted them to fly it at a very specific low altitude, at a very specific slow speed, with the landing gear down and with the wing flaps at a specific angle. And he wanted them to leave the rear stairs of the plane, which on a Boeing 727 could actually be lowered while the plane was flying, unlocked. The pilots, along with the FBI and Northwest Orient, all realized what Cooper was planning to do. Cooper was going to jump out of the plane. The plane took off from Seattle at 7:40 p.m. And once it was in the air, Cooper ordered the flight attendant Tina Mucklow to go into the front of the plane with the pilots and to shut the curtain that separated first class from the rear of the plane. So Tina walked to the front and she pulled the curtain shut. And Cooper was alone in the back of the plane with the money. Then, at approximately 8:00 p.m., one of the crew members inside the cockpit noticed a small light flash on the instrument panel, indicating that somebody in the back of the plane had just opened the rear stairs. A few minutes later, at approximately 8:13 p.m., the pilots felt the plane suddenly bob upward, which was consistent with a sudden change in weight distribution, consistent with somebody having just jumped off of the rear stairs. The plane continued on to Reno, Nevada, where it landed at about 10:15 p.m. And when FBI agents boarded the plane after it landed, they found the rear stairs down. They found Cooper's black tie sitting on his seat, and they found no sign of Cooper or of the $200,000 or of 2 of the 4 parachutes he had asked for. Cooper had jumped. He had jumped somewhere out over the mountains and forests of southwestern Washington state, in the pitch dark, into a thunderstorm, and nobody ever saw him again. Now, the moment Cooper disappeared into the sky, one of the largest, most obsessive, and most detailed manhunts in the entire history of the FBI began. Because the FBI knew, based on the flight path of the plane, roughly where Cooper had jumped from. He had jumped from a stretch of airspace over an area of southwestern Washington called the Cascade Mountains. So the FBI mobilized hundreds of agents, along with local law enforcement, along with the United States military, and they started combing the forests of southwestern Washington on foot, on horseback, and by helicopter, looking for Cooper's body, or his parachute, or any of the $200,000 in $20 bills. The FBI knew exactly which bills were in the ransom, because the numbers on all 10,000 of the $20 bills had been recorded before the money was handed over to Cooper. And that meant if any of those bills ever showed up in circulation anywhere in the United States, the FBI would know instantly. So the FBI notified every bank, every store, every casino, every place that handled cash across the entire country. They released the serial numbers to the public. They basically told the whole country, if you ever get a $20 bill and the serial number matches this list, that money came from the D.B. Cooper hijacking. And for 9 years, not a single one of those $20 bills showed up. Anywhere. Then, in February of 1980, a family was having a picnic on the banks of the Columbia River in a spot called Tenna Bar in Washington state, about 20 miles from where the plane had been at the time of the jump. And a little boy who was 8 years old, whose name was Brian Ingram, was digging around in the sand at the edge of the river. And he pulled up 3 bundles of $20 bills. The bills were rotten. They were falling apart. They were still bundled together with rubber bands that had partially deteriorated. And when investigators tested the serial numbers on the bills, they came back as a match. It was $5,880 of the ransom money from the D.B. Cooper hijacking, but it was the only money that ever turned up. Not another single bill from the ransom has ever been found anywhere in the world. And Cooper himself was, at this point, part of American folk legend, because the mystery of who he actually was and whether he had survived the jump had captivated the country. There had been songs written about him, there had been movies made about him, there had been documentaries, there had been TV specials, And basically every couple of years, somebody new would come forward claiming to be the real D.B. Cooper, or claiming that their father or their uncle or their neighbor had confessed on their deathbed to being the real D.B. Cooper. The FBI, over the years, seriously investigated dozens of suspects. There was a paratrooper from Michigan named Kenneth Christensen, whose brother went on record after his death saying he was sure Kenneth had done it. There was a Vietnam War veteran named Robert Rackstraw, who had a criminal record and matched Cooper's physical description. There was even a theory, taken seriously by some investigators, that